headmistress authority. So the idea here of talking about somebody who is in at her prime, and especially when it is related to wisdom, definitely there would be lot of unconventional pattern of teaching, because you have already uh, caught hold of the idea of what's best for the students, and you would want to deliver that through the idea of wisdom. And when you teach in a certain manner that challenges both the curriculum and the headmistress authority, definitely you are no more in a normal group of people considered, rather you are somewhere close to controversy. So she does not follow school's rules. She devotes her lessons to art, history, her own personal experiences, her controversial political views, including her admiration of Mussolini and fascism. Her style is magnetic, and she chooses a small group of girls and she names them Brody set. We all have sometimes, we come across students who become our pets, so that becomes a very proud moment for both the teachers and the students. So here we see there is a small group of girls. She has chosen to create a small group, and she has named the small group as the Brody set. And these six girls, they are named as Sandy, Rose, Jenny, Monica, Eunice, and Mary. And these girls are groomed to see themselves as elite, different from other pupils, and destined for greatness under Miss Brody's guidance. We understand Miss Brody throughout the novel as a very complex character. She appears to be a champion of individuality and culture on the surface level, but she manipulates her group of girls very subtly and insistently. She imposes her romantic ideals and political opinions on them, and she tries her best to shape and influence their thoughts and emotions to fit her worldview. So, one of the most striking examples of this manipulation is in a situation where she tries to orchestrate a romantic affair between one of the girls, Rose, and the married art teacher, Mr. Lloyd. So, though Miss Brodie herself is in love with Mr. Lloyd, she refuses to act on it directly due to his marriage. So, instead, she attempts to live vicariously through Rose, whose beauty she sees as suitable for seduction. So, try to understand the kind of manipulation the teacher might be very insistently doing towards the students. This plan ultimately fails, but it also exposes the troubling nature of Miss Brodie's interferences in her students' lives. Among the Brody set, the girls, there is a girl called Sandy, Sandy Stranger. She gradually emerges as the most insightful and psychologically aware student. She begins to see through Miss Brodie's charm and questions the morality behind her influence. Sandy becomes disillusioned with Brodie's idealistic image of herself and her authoritarian way of shaping the girls' lives. It is Sandy who ultimately betrays Miss Brodie by informing the headmistress of her fascist sympathies. This betrayal leads to Brodie's forced retirement from the school, and this was such um, an event that devastates her but does not fully explain the cause. Brody never finds out who was responsible, and this mystery torments her until her death from cancer years later. The narrative returns repeatedly to Sandy's later life, revealing that she eventually becomes a Roman Catholic nun and a writer on psychology. Her conversion, while surprising on the surface level, also symbolizes a complete rejection of Miss Brodie's values and the manipulations she once exercised over her students. When asked late in life about what influenced her the most, Sandy answers simply that there was a Miss Jean Brodie in her prime, capturing the essence of how deeply Brodie's presence affected her, even as she chose to oppose her. So, Muriel Sparks' novel is not only a portrait of an eccentric, charismatic teacher, but there is a subtle exploration of power and manipulation and the dangerous appeal of authoritarian influence, whether in the form of personal relationships or education or politics. Though Miss Brodie speaks passionately of nurturing independence in her girls, but what she truly seeks is to mold them into extensions of her own ego and ideology. The novel ultimately suggests that charisma without moral clarity can be just as oppressive as any system it claims to subvert. And what we see at the end is loss of innocence, complexity of mentorship through this character of Miss Jean Brodie, the ambiguous nature of betrayal, and sometimes the novel also challenges the minds of the readers to consider whether influence, no matter how well intentioned, can ever truly be free of ego, and whether shaping someone's destiny is ever a justifiable act. So this is the basic story of the novel. Let's go to the background of it. Uh, there's a transformation in literature that we find, particularly English literature, during and after the early 20th century. This period marked a profound transition in thought, art, literary forms, breaking away from the long held belief in a universal human nature. As a pre industrial way of life crumbled under the weight of industrialization, and there are urbanization also. There was urbanization, there were global conflicts. Writers began to reflect a world that was no longer stable or predictable, to that matter, even rational. This collapse of old certainties led to a literary consciousness deeply aware of alienation, fragmentation, and crisis. The literature of the time increasingly portrayed utility. There emerged a self conscious, introspective tone and um, a skeptical stance towards established narratives and conventions. The there were a lot of disruption that was caused by World War One and later because of World War Two too, and they all had the wars had lasting impact on the literary imagination. W. H. Auden famously described the post-war period as the age of anxiety during 1947. The psychological and physical trauma that these words were capable of inheriting in the minds of people, the battlefield that offered horrors, the development of nuclear weapons, and the reconfiguration of political borders, all of them they created a global atmosphere of desolation and uncertainty. Literature became a medium for reckoning with these changes. The deaths of literary icons such as James Joyce, Virginia Woolf symbolized the passing of an era, and with their passing came a new literary movement shaped by the disillusionment and devastation of war. Writers such as Virginia Woolf, D.H. Lawrence had already suggested that human character itself had changed around 110 1910, or by making the early signs of what would come to be called modernism. From that moment onward, literature underwent a radical transformation in style and subject matter. Writers moved away from realist representations and linear narratives, instead, embracing new forms such as stream of consciousness and free verse. These innovations were not merely stylistic choices but reflected a deeper questioning of the very nature of reality. W.B. Yeats, one of the major figures of this era, also embodied this transitional spirit, reflecting both a sense of loss and the emergence of new, often spiritual possibilities. There was a new kind of liberalism that took shape in the aftermath of war. Critics like Lionel Trilling, uh, who wrote the book The Liberal Imagination during 1950, argued that literature needed to reflect a tragic sense of life and embody moral realism, an awareness of the complexities, ambiguities, and contradictions that defined human experiences. Fiction became a space for exploring skepticism, not just in political or social terms, but as a deeper existential mode of inquiry. Writers sought to portray the richness and variability of human nature, often placing their characters in working or lower middle class settings, where themes of alienation, anguish, and purposelessness came to dominate. One of the most significant developments during this period was the emergence of absurdist literature, particularly through the works of Samuel Beckett. The play Waiting for Godot helped define what came to be known as the theatre of absurd. In this genre, human existence is portrayed as fundamentally meaningless, irrational, and uncertain. The term surd, borrowed from mathematics to denote something that cannot be expressed in finite terms, was appropriated to describe the formless and amorphous attitudes that marked much of the literature of the time. Realism was no longer seen as sufficient to capture the depth of human experience. A quick distinction between modernism and postmodernism reveals that modernism was defined by conscious break from traditional structures and the drive to explore new forms of representation. Postmodernism extended and complicated these trends. The postmodern sensibility rejected symbols of authority and hierarchy, embracing a more eclectic, fragmented, and playful approach to storytelling. Postmodern literature often reflects randomness, disjointed narratives, and parody. Writers used these techniques to destabilize meaning and question the coherence of traditional literary forms. The shift led to the rise of the anti novel, a genre in which the traditional elements of plot, character development, linear narrative were often discarded. These works focused on the repetition of images, factured time sequences, and unconventional beginnings and endings. The fiction during the period 1950s and beyond thus became experimental in form and anti-ideological in content. At the same time, social realities were not entirely abandoned. Many writers continued to be deeply engaged with questions of class, community, and the individual's place within society. Taking you to the next section of Unit 1, Modes of Narration. In the aftermath of World War II, fiction entered a period of significant transformation and experimentation, giving rise to various distinctive modes of narration. One of the noble strand was the narrative of nostalgia, which emerged strongly in British fiction during 1950s. Writers working within this mode often looked backward, driven by a kind of emotional and intellectual longing for a simpler, more innocent past. This nostalgia was not merely sentimental, but often seeking to reconnect with what was seen as humankind's original state, an existence untouched by the corruptions of modern civilization. This yearning for origins frequently manifested in a critique of industrialism, uh, material progress, and moral ambiguity of modern life enabled many authors to develop a distance for contemporary civilization and instead romanticize primal human instincts. So, these narratives thus rejected the sophistication of urban life and technological advancement, choosing instead to explore what humanity might look like stripped of its modern pretenses. William Golding's work exemplifies this mode of fiction. In Lord of the Flies, he presents a group of schoolboys stranded on an uninhabited island who, when left to govern themselves, descend into savagery. The novel allegorizes the innate human capacity for violence and moral collapse, suggesting that evil is a fundamental, inescapable part of human nature. Golding continues this exploration of humanity primitive core in The Inheritors, written in 1955, which imagines the extinction of a gentle, childlike Neanderthal race at the hands of more aggressive, evolved humans. Here, the loss of innocence is recast as a historical violence that brings forth modern man, but at the cost of compassion and spiritual simplicity. Parallel to Golding's break, uh, American writer Saul Bellow also engaged with this nostalgic impulse in Henderson The Rain King, written in 1959. Though marked different in tone, Bellow's novel also searches for a more authentic human experience through its protagonist's journey to Africa. The novel blends satire with philosophical inquiry, ultimately depicting Henderson's quest as both absurd and deeply meaningful, revealing the tensions between civilization and instinct, rationality and emotion. The term Roman fluvium, this is in the next section, which means river novel, refers to series of novels, each capable of standing alone, yet interconnected through recurring characters and themes, forming a broad and continuous narrative arc. This form became popular as it allowed writers to explore changes in society over long periods, giving room for detailed psychological and sociological exploration. The tradition of the Roman fluve was inspired by French writers like Balzac and Zola, and in the 18th literary tradition, it found major exponents in C.P. Snow, whose Strangers and Brothers spans from 1925 onward and serves as a document of English social history. Other writers, for example, Henry Williamson, who wrote a chronicle of ancient sunlight, in 15 volumes, and Anthony Powell, whose 12-volume series, A Dance to the Music of Time, chronicles British social and political life through decades. Some political narratives now in the post war literary world, political allegory became a crucial mode of expression. Writers used fiction to explore the failures and dangers of political ideologies, particularly totalitarianism. A major figure in this genre was George Orwell, whose novel Animal Farm, written in 1945, is a seemingly simple fable but functions as a powerful critic of Stalinist Russia. It allegorizes the betrayal of revolutionary ideals, specifically Stalin's betrayal of Trotsky, the original goals of socialism. This period also saw the rise of the so called angry young men, a term popularized after the success of John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger in 1956. These writers represented a post war generation disillusioned by British society's moral and social stagnation. Narratives of morality was also a key feature. Post war fiction delved deeply into moral conflict, particularly through the work of Graham Greene. Greene's novels are typically set against a backdrop of political and personal crisis, and they explore themes of espionage, betrayal, and existential doubt. His narratives do not present clear moral binaries, but rather grapple with ambiguous, painful dilemmas at the heart of human experiences. Green wrote a book in The Confidential Agent in 1939, where he introduces readers to the theme of pity, while in the book Human Factor in 1978, he emphasizes on gratitude. His novels such as The Heart of the Matter and End of the Affair illustrate his tendency to focus on the strange contradictions of human nature, how good intentions can cause pain, and how guilt and grace often coexist. The ironic documentary as a component emerged as another post war literary form, best exemplified by Evelyn Waugh. Waugh's fiction is rooted in satire and often depicts characters in absurd or extreme situations that reflect the disintegration of modern values. His writing is marked by black humor, parody, and irony, making him a master of what might be called the tragic comic, tragic comic mode. In the Ordeal of Gilbert Pinhold, Waugh presents the story of a one successful writer whose health and creative powers have failed him. His technique underscores the psychological dislocation of post war individuals and the absurdity of their attempts to find order in chaos. So, this is a bit of Unit 1. We'll go to Unit 2. Unit 2 is quite a lengthy unit here because it describes mural sparks, life, works, and also it also talks about the text. Let's start with the life first. Muriel Spark was born in 1918 in Edinburgh, Scotland, emerged as one of the most distinctive and influential voices in 20th century English literature. Her early life and education were steeped in a rich cultural background. Her father, Bernard Camberg, was a Jewish engineer, and her mother, Sarah Elizabeth Maud, had Italian roots. Spark attended James Gillespie's School for Girls, an experience she later fictionalized in her most famous novel, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. She finishes her school in 1935 and chooses to work at a private day school, not for salary but for free lessons in shorthand and typing. In 1937, she became engaged to Sydney Oswald Spark and soon joined him in southern Rhodesia, modern day Zimbabwe, where they married. However, her marriage quickly became troubled. Her husband began to show signs of mental illness and violent behavior, making their relationship untenable. With the outbreak of Second World War, her husband joined the army, and Spark pressed for and obtained a divorce by 1942. In 1944, despite the wartime danger posed by German submarines, she bravely returned to England. Once back in London, she took up a job with the Political Intelligence Department of the Foreign Office. Her work there involved psychological warfare and crafting anti Nazi propaganda, providing her with insights into the power of language and narrative, skills that would inform her later fiction. After the war, Spark began establishing herself in the literary world. She worked at Argento, a respected quarterly magazine, where she gained valuable experience in editing and proofreading. 1947, she became the editor of the Poetry Review. It's a prestigious position, particularly for someone who is still in her 20s. However, her strong support for modernism in poetry created friction with the traditionalist members of the Poetry Society, eventually leading to her dismissal in 1948. Undeterred, she launched her own magazine named Forum, continuing to write poetry and establishing her literary voice. 1952, she published a collection of poetry titled The Fanfarlo and the Other Verse. However, a major turning point in her life came with her conversion to Roman Catholicism in 1954, and Spark attributed this decision in part to the influence of the writings of Cardinal John Henry Newman. She described her conversion not as a dramatic revelation but as an affirmation of deeply held beliefs. In her autobiography, she wrote that becoming a Catholic enabled her to see life as a unified whole rather than as a fragmented series of events. There was a shift in her worldview, she later claimed gave her spiritual clarity and creative confidence to begin writing novels. Mural Spark, literary philosophy, her approach to writing, and her development as a writer across different genres such as poetry and short stories um, would be under the section The Works of Muriel Spark. So there was an autobiography that she has written, that is Curriculum Vitae. Muriel Spark emphasizes that all experience is good for an artist and that the essentials of literature lie out in the world, meaning real world experiences and observations are central to the writer's creative work. She believed that literature draws from life and that fiction should emerge from reality. Spark's own life is reflected deeply in her works. Her job at the intelligence department of the Foreign Office during World War II, where she worked on psychological warfare, and propaganda had a lasting impact on her fiction. She became adept at camouflaging facts, using layers of truth and manipulation in her narratives, something that became a recurring theme in her novel. Her characters often manipulate reality or struggle to discover their own truths in complicated environments. Spark believed that life is inherently chaotic and the writer's role is to observe, interpret, and create order through storytelling. She saw the novel as a medium through which the authorial perspective can be conveyed via multiple voices and characters. Even mundane or trivial life events are reimagined in her fiction to reflect deeper truths about existence, morality, and human nature. Through reimagining and reinterpretation, Spark's work transforms ordinary experiences into narratives filled with symbolic and philosophical depth. Her early career, her early writing career was a beginning of her creative work, and exactly at the age of 9. She later turned to writing short stories, particularly during her time in Africa, but eventually chose the novel as her main medium of literary expression. Despite this shift, poetry and short stories remained essential to her body of work and served as key stepping stones in her development. She has written number of poetries during her years in Rhodesia, modern Zimbabwe, starting when she was 19. Her early poems were eventually compiled into a collection published in 1952 under the title The Fanfarlo and Other Words. Poetry continued to be a part of her life, and she later published collected poems one in 1967 and Sothipais and poems in 1982. Sparks' poetry is noted for being lyrical, subjective, meaningful, that it often reflects personal emotions, inner thoughts, and individuals' perspectives. The themes in her poetry frequently arise from her own life experiences, whether personal relationships, cultural tensions, or philosophical questions. But not as widely recognized as her novels, Sparks' poetry reveals the emotional and intellectual foundations of her prose. Next, we discuss the kind of short stories that were heavily influenced by her experiences in Africa, which provided both the background and the thematic inspiration for many of them. There was one significant story, The Go Away Bird, that illustrates the thematic inspiration. It was written after a poem by the same name and captures the homesickness and alienation felt by white settlers in the African colonies. The story is a nuanced look at identity, cultural dislocation, and the psychological challenges of living between two worlds. Another important story, Bang Bang You Are Dead, is based on a real life incident involving Spark's friend Neeta, which gives it a strong autobiographical element. This story further demonstrates Spark's ability to take real events and transform them into fiction that reveals deeper social, emotional, or philosophical truths. Mural Spark's short stories often draw from real life. Uh, for example, Bang Bang You Are Dead is based on a true story involving Spark's friend McKevin, who was tragically shot dead by her husband. There was another story, The Curtain Blown by the Breeze, deals with apartheid and racial violence as Spark witnessed it in Rhodesia. So these stories are not merely fictional accounts, rather, they are creative imaginings of disturbing realities. She also wrote for children, including the illustrated story A Very Fine Clock, 1968, which, like much of her work, blends whimsical imagination with moral undertones. Just as in her poetry, Sparks' short stories are deeply symbolic, personal, reflective of her inner world and real life encounters. Coming now to the novels, The Comforters, that was written in 1957. That was her first novel written after her conversion to Roman Catholicism, dealing with metaphysical and literary questions. The protagonist, Caroline Rose, becomes aware that she is a character in a novel struggling with the voices of the author, a metaphor for divine control and human agency. This meta-fictional theme reflects Sparks' interest in free will versus determinism and faith versus reason. She also wrote Robinson in 1958, inspired by the Robinson Crusoe myth. The story focuses on plane crash survivors stranded on an island. It explores isolation, human nature, and civilization through both literal and symbolic lenses. The island and the character Robinson stand in for broader themes of identity and survival. She also wrote Memento Mori, The Ballad of Peckham Rye, The Bachelors, and The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie in 1960. This was her most famous novel, telling the story of an eccentric school teacher in Edinburgh. The character name is Miss Jean Brodie, who exerts undue influence over students and is eventually ousted due to her fascist sympathies. The novel explores power, loyalty, betrayal, and idealism, and it was later adapted to a celebrated film. And besides this, she has also written The Girls of Slender Means, The Mandelbaum Gate, The Public Image, The Driver's Seat, Not to Disturb, The Hot House by the East River, The Abbess of Crewe, The Takeover, The Territorial Rights, Loitering with Intent, The Only Problem, The Far Cry from Kensington, Symposium, Reality and Dreams, and so on. So Sparks' final novel, Reality and Dreams, written in 1996, centers on a filmmaker whose dreams blend with reality, raising questions about creativity, control, and the nature of perception. This was all about her works. Let's begin with the textual part. The text, chapter 1 of the novel, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. The context, the setting is Edinburgh, Scotland, and it talks about an eccentric but idealistic teacher, Miss Jean Brodie, who teaches at the conservative Marcia Blaine Students' School for Girls. The novel opens in the autumn of 1930 and immediately introduces a contrast between the rigid, tradition bound atmosphere of the school and the progressive, unconventional methods of Miss Brodie. She sees herself as a transformative force in this dull environment, suggesting her desire to bring change and vitality to the otherwise strict academic setting. Her motto is Safety does not come first, goodness, truth, and beauty come first. And her motto reflects her resistance to institutional conformity and her belief in a higher moral and aesthetic mission, even if it involves risk or rebellion. Miss Brodie uses her charm. She is charismatic, she is romantic. Her romantic imagination is quite uh, factor to win the loyalty of a select group of students whom she refers to as the creme de la creme. This Brody set becomes a tightly knit circle of six young girls, distinguished from the rest of the school by their unique personalities and by their loyalty to Miss Brody. Instead of conventional lessons, she fills their time with vivid stories of a romantic past, particularly her doomed love affair with Hugh Carruthers, a man who died in World War One. These tales cast her as a tragic heroine in the girls' eyes, reinforcing their admiration and emotional attachment to her. The six girls who form the Brody set are each defined with distinctive traits. There is Monica Douglas, who is noted for her mathematical skills and temper. There is Rose Stanley, who is recognized for her sexuality. There is Eunice Gardiner, who is a gymnast full of energy. There is Sandy Stranger, who is marked by her small, shrewd eyes and precise speech. There is Jenny Gray, who is graceful and talented in drama. And there is finally Mary McGregor, the least remarkable, is quite awkward and often bullied by the others and by Miss Brodie herself. Despite their differences, they are unified by Miss Brodie's influence and are marked by a certain aloofness from their peers, which results in a lack of team spirit and social integration within the larger school community. As the girls mature, Miss Brodie's influence becomes more intense. She invites them to her home, shares her private conflicts with the school administration, particularly her ongoing battles with the headmistress, Miss Mackay, and also portrays herself as a victim of misunderstanding and oppression. While doing this, she deepens their emotional dependence on her, constantly reminding them that she is dedicating the best years of her life, her prime, to their education and moral shaping. Miss Brodie positions herself as both a martyr and a mentor. The girls respond with admiration, gratitude, and a protective loyalty that shields her from the efforts of the headmistress and others to have her dismissed. Under Miss Brodie's guidance, the girls are exposed to ideas far outside the traditional curriculum. They learn about Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, Renaissance painters, and the love life of Charlotte Bronte, as well as topics like skincare, menstruation, astrology, and Einstein's theories. This topic chosen by Miss Brodie reflect her wide-ranging, eclectic, and sometimes inappropriate priorities. Although the Brody set is not particularly well prepared in conventional academic subjects, they stand out for their worldliness and individuality, which they exhibit by wearing their school hats at unique angles, a subtle but telling gesture of rebellion and self expression. By the time they're 16, the Brody set has grown into a symbol of defiance against the restrictive norms of the school. However, beneath the surface of this intellectual and aesthetic mentoring lies a more troubling reality: Miss Brodie's manipulations. These clogged in affection and a sense of mission begin to raise questions about her influence and judgment. Her fascination with authoritarian figures like Mussolini and her attempts to direct the girls' lives, including their romantic choices, reveal the darker side of her control. Eventually, one of the girls, Sandy Stranger, comes to see through Miss Brodie's manipulations and betrays her to the headmistress. This betrayal, which leads to Miss Brodie's forced retirement, marks the climax of the novel and raises significant moral questions about power, free will, loyalty, and the consequences of charismatic authority. Chapter 2 of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie continues to develop both the central characters and the thematic structure of the novel, particularly the influence of Miss Brodie on her pupils and the long term consequences of that influence. The chapter begins by looking into the later life of Mary MacGregor, one of the least distinguished members of the Brodie set. Often mocked and dismissed as a slow, silent girl during her school years, Mary's adult life is shown to be equally unfortunate. After being stood up by a boyfriend, a corporal in the army, she remembers her school years with Miss Brodie as the happiest period of her life. This nostalgic view reflects the emotional shelter Miss Brodie provided to her. However, superficial or manipulation still did not get a relax. Of, give me a second. Okay, so now this was about Mary MacGregor, and she believes that her school years with the teacher, Miss Brodie, was the happiest period of her life, and currently her life ends tragically in a hotel fire at the age of 24, and the narrator implies that her dullness and confusion were contributing factors to her death, as she failed to find a safe escape route in time. Mary's fate is a grim testament to the vulnerability of those who were shaped by, but never quite empowered by, Miss Brodie's guidance. So, although she believed that her school years were the happiest, but it was under the superficial manipulation that Miss Brodie provided to her through her emotional shelter. Meanwhile, Stranger and Jenny Gray, the more imaginative and emotionally perceptive members of the Brodie set, also reflect on their youth with a sense of ecstatic happiness, particularly fascinated by their favorite teacher, love story with the soldier, huge characters. This fascination drives them to co author a secret literary work called The Mountain Airy, a romantic and a highly dramatized story inspired by Miss Brodie's real lost love. The tale is laced with sexual suggestion, revealing the girl's growing curiosity about adult relationships. However, they idealize Miss Brodie's romance as pure and untarnished, rejecting the idea of sexual involvement in their own imagined futures. Yet, this contradiction is clear when they later plan a visit to the museum to closely examine a nude statue of a Greek god, believing that Miss Brodie, unlike other adults, would not be scandalized by such curiosity. This shows both their admiration of her unconventional spirit and their increasing preoccupation with sexuality. This chapter also includes a scene from Miss Brodie's poetry class where she recites Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. Through this poem, Miss Brodie teaches what she believes to be essential female virtues, most notably composure. She elevates the romantic ideal of womanhood, linking grace and restraint to the strength of character she wants to see in her pupils. Mr. Lothar, there is a music teacher at the school. She is captivated by Miss Brodie's voice and presence during these lessons, and although he proposes marriage, she turns him down, saying her rude dedication lies with her girls. She claims that they are her vocation and she has become her uh, their prime rather than pursuing a conventional path of matrimony. That is not the case for Miss Brodie. As Miss Brodie's influence over the girls deepens, she becomes more confiding in them about their personal battles at school, especially her conflicts with the headmistress, Miss Mackay. She trusts not only the girls but also their parents to keep quiet about her advanced educational methods. The girls become her secret allies, bound to her by their shared confidences and their loyalty. She takes them on long walks through Edinburgh, particularly the older, more historical parts of the city. Through Sandy's recollections, we learn how significant these walks were in shaping their perception of the world and of themselves. Miss Brodie sees herself as the guiding force of their lives, orchestrating their destinies as though she were appointed by divine will. During one such walk, the Brodie set is exposed to the grimmer realities of life in Edinburgh. They encounter children playing in harsh winter conditions, a man who has stabbed his wife, and another man ruined by alcoholism and unemployment. These experiences provided a jarring moment of contrast to the romantic ideals Miss Brodie often preaches, but she uses these events as teaching moments, bringing the girls face to face with real suffering and inequality. At the same time, she casually reveals that there is an inquiry into her teaching methods prompted by the headmistress. She defends herself by stating her belief in education as a process of drawing out what is already inside a person, in contrast to traditional instruction, which she sees as authoritarian and limiting. She insists that there is a fundamental philosophical difference between her and the teachers, stating we differ at the root. Despite these challenges, Miss Brodie expresses complete confidence at her girls would never betray her to the school authorities. She trusts that the loyalty she has carefully cultivated within the Brodie set will protect her. However, the narrative quietly plants the seeds of betrayal, hinting that one of the girls eventually does reveal her methods to Miss Mackay. This event looms in the background of the story, and its eventual revelation proves critical to the plot. Years after Miss Brodie's death, Jenny, now a nurse and married, tells her husband about the extraordinary influence the teacher had on the Brodie set. She still cannot forget the emotional power Miss Brodie wielded and even suggests placing flowers on her grave when they return to Edinburgh. Yet she also voices lingering uncertainty about who among them betrayed Miss Brodie. This mystery is left hanging for now, but casts a long shadow over their memories. Sandy Stranger, who eventually becomes a nun named Sister Helena of the Transfiguration, also reflects on those walks through Edinburgh. For her, they marked a transformation of consciousness, a new awareness of a city, and world beyond the boundaries of her former understanding. She credits Miss Brodie as the most influential person in her life, though not necessarily in a positive way. Sandy's overview of the world evolves significantly over time, and her later work, a book titled The Transfiguration of the Commonplace, is a psychological treatise exploring how ordinary things become meaningful through perception. Chapter 3 of the novel continues to explore the complex character of Miss Brodie and the influence she wielded over her students while revealing further dimensions of her personality, her romantic entanglements, and the eventual unraveling of her authority. The narrative begins by situating Miss Brodie within the broader context of 1930s society. She is portrayed not as an isolated figure, but as part of a larger social movement of unmarried women, many of them teachers, social workers, or religious activists who sought to fill their lives with meaning through passionate engagement with ideas, politics, and reform. These women were articulate, energetic, and often feminist in their outlook, believing in independence and the strength of their own convictions. Miss Brodie, with her charismatic teaching style and unwavering self belief, fits perfectly into this mold. She saw her prime, a concept she often repeated as time of growth, exploration, and learning, even though she would later be surprised by how it came to an end. One key moment occurs during a history lesson when the headmistress, Miss Mackay, interrupts Miss Brodie's class to remind the students of their upcoming qualifying examination. This moment illustrates the tension between Miss Brodie's idealistic, often self indulgent teaching and the practical regulated demands of the school system. Though the interruption flutters her, Miss Brodie quickly regains control, asserting that qualifying examination or no qualifying examination, her students would benefit from her personal experiences, specifically her time in Italy. She proceeds to praise Mussolini, highlighting her uncritical admiration for authoritarian figures as long as they align with her sense of grandeur and order. Her classroom becomes a space for anecdote, admiration, and digression, not structured learning. Miss Brodie's colleagues largely resent her, sensing her arrogance and deviation from academic norms. However, she finds sympathy and perhaps infatuation in two male characters, Gordon Lother, the music teacher, and Teddy Lloyd, the art teacher. Miss Brodie is oblivious to their rivalry and sees them merely as allies in a hostile environment. Yet the Brody set, especially Sandy and Jenny, notice Miss Lloyd more keenly. He is handsome, sophisticated, and mysterious, particularly because he lost an arm in the war. He captivates the girls not only because of his physical appearance, but also because of his artistic manner and romantic aura. A scene in Miss Lloyd's art class where he discusses Botticelli's Primavera is a notable scene for its subtle humor and symbolic tension. His description of the nude figures in the painting provoke nervous giggles among the students, especially Mary. Miss Brodie, furious at what she sees as vulgarity and immaturity, punishes Mary, which restores discipline. This moment underlines how Miss Brodie, despite her unconventional ideas, is fiercely controlling when it comes to know how her persona and ideals are perceived by her students. Then comes a turning point. Monica Douglas reports that she witnessed Mr. Lloyd kissing Miss Brodie in the art room. This sparks excitement, disbelief, and obsession among the Brodie set. Sandy, who often plays the role of the analytical and skeptical observer, interrogates Monica before accepting the truth. Once the story is believed, it becomes a secret among the set, fueling their imagination and speculation for months. Miss Brodie's demeanor changes. She begins dressing more stylishly, wearing jewelry, suggesting that the kiss, whether romantic or symbolic, has invigorated her sense of self. Soon after, Miss Brodie and Mr. Lothar are both absent from school for 2 weeks due to illness. Their overlapping leave stirs gossip, and even the substitute teacher, Miss Gaunt, hints at a potential romantic entanglement. When Miss Brodie returns, she collaborates more openly with Miss Lothar in musical rehearsals and the students begin to suspect a love triangle. However, Sandy, deeply observant, realizes the irony. Mr. Lothar is in love with Miss Brodie, but she is in love with Mr. Lloyd. This tangled emotional web is especially interesting because Sandy cannot imagine Miss Brodie engaging in any sexual relationship, and yet she cannot dismiss the possibility either. This ambiguity reflects how Miss Brodie exists in a space between idealism and reality, appearance and truth. A disturbing subplot involves Jenny, who is accosted by a man in an isolated area who exposes himself to her. Traumatized but physically unharmed, Jenny reports the incident to the police and confides only in Sandy. Sandy's response is deeply revealing. She becomes fascinated, even obsessed with the event, and develops a morbid curiosity that leads to a growing revulsion towards sex itself. This experience quietly shapes Sandy's internal world, setting her on a different psychological trajectory. Instead of fixating on the perpetrator, Sandy believes to idolize the anonymous policewoman who interviews Jenny. This unnamed woman becomes a powerful mental figure for Sandy, one of order, safety, and authority, possibly laying the foundation for her eventual conversion to Catholicism and a life as the nun. Throughout this chapter, Brodyset's obsession with sex intensifies, and they begin to see sexual implications even in mechanical actions like the movements of sewing machines. They write fictional letters between Miss Brodie and Mr. Lothar that are romantic and sexually suggestive, though they know Miss Brodie would never indulge in such intimacy. She remains adamant, and she has dedicated her prime to her girls, not to marriage or romantic entanglement. Chapter 4, there is a narrative shift to a new phase in the lives of the Brody set. As they enter senior school, this transition marks a decline in Miss Brodie's influence over the girls, as the structured, subject oriented senior environment replaces the romanticized and free flowing education she once provided. No longer the dominating presence in their daily academic lives, Miss Brodie must now exert her influence from the periphery. The senior school teacher are more invested in their respective disciplines than in shaping their students' personal development. This results in a new sense of freedom, curiosity, and even uncertainty among the girls, particularly highlighted in their science classes. The science room, a new exciting environment, becomes a metaphor for discovery and unpredictability. When Mary McGregor, the dullest and the most timid of the Brody set, panics during an experiment involving magnesium flares, the moment becomes both comic and symbolic of the dangers of experimentation, intellectual, emotional, and social. Miss Mackey, the headmistress, seizes this period of reduced contact between Miss Brodie and her former pupils as an opportunity to sever the bond entirely. She disapproves of Miss Brodie's unorthodox teaching style and seeks to discredit her. Miss Mackey even tries to manipulate Mary McGregor into revealing something incriminating about Miss Brodie's personal life. But Mary, in her dim witted innocence, fails to understand the intention behind Miss Mackey's question, rendering the entire interrogation fruitless. Instead of confessing secrets, she accepts Miss Mackey's inquiries as facts and agrees with them passively, which frustrates Miss Mackey and causes her plan to fail. Meanwhile, the school introduces a house system to build camaraderie and encourage extracurricular involvement. However, the Brody set remains immune to this effort. Their loyalty to Miss Brodie supersedes any institutional allegiance. They continue to visit her, keep her updated about school affairs, and remain emotionally bound to her despite physical distance. Miss Brodie, in turn, continues to share personal stories with them, especially about the domestic issues facing Gordon Lothar, the music teacher. Lothar's housekeeper has left him. The sewing mistress, the Kerr sisters have stepped in to manage his household. Miss Brodie regards the Kerrs with suspicion and mild disdain, seeing them as pliable and easily manipulated, especially by the severe and conservative Miss Gaunt, who encourages their involvement in Lothar's life. Miss Brodie continues her weekly Sunday visits to Mr. Lothar's house, maintaining a public association with him out of duty rather than passion. Her romantic feelings remain directed as Mr. Lloyd, the married art teacher, yet societal norms and her own sense of propriety prevent her from openly pursuing him. She sacrifices personal fulfillment for the appearance of respectability. Despite this outward conformity, her emotional reality is more complex. She is torn between social expectations and inner desire. Her feelings manifest physically. She loses weight, an outward sign of her emotional and moral strain. When she notices Mr. Lothar also appearing thinner, she assumes the Kerrs are not taking adequate care of him and considers removing them from his household. Miss Brodie's self image continues to be rooted in her romanticized view of the past and the sense of family pride. She justifies her decisions by claiming lineage from a man named Will Brodie, a rebellious figure who lived boldly, even criminally, but with flair and fearlessness. Her anecdote about Will Brodie, who allegedly died cheerfully on a gallows of his own design, reinforces her admiration for defiance, risk, and personal freedom. At age 43, Miss Brodie begins to challenge social norms more openly and even more into Mr. Lothar's house. However, she maintains the appearance of propriety by telling her girls she returns to her old lodgings at night. The Brody set continues to visit her in pairs every weekend. During these visits, Miss Brody covertly seeks information about Mr. Lloyd through the girls. Sandy becomes her primary source, especially since she alone fully understands Miss Brody's concealed emotions. Sandy is observant and perceptive. She becomes a quiet analyst of Miss Brody's intentions and flaws. She reports on Mr. Lloyd's home life, his chaotic yet warm household with 6 children, his Roman Catholic faith, his wife, Deirdre, the surprising fact that Rose Stanley, one of the Brody's girls, is modeling for his portraits. This choice of Rose, who is known for her beauty but not for intellectual depth, subtly indicates Miss Brody's influence. She had long suggested that Rose was destined for Mr. Lloyd, as if orchestrating a romantic future that she could not have for herself. The chapter ends with Miss Brody's announcement that she would spend the summer holiday in Germany instead of her usual destination, Italy. She entrusts Mr. Lothar's care once more to the Kerr sisters, stepping back from the relationship. This decision to visit Germany, especially considering the political climate of the 1930, also hints at Miss Brodie's continued fascination with authoritarian regimes, having previously expressed admiration for Mussolini. Then we have chapter 5, and in chapter 5, murals spark delves deeper into the psychological and emotional complexities of the relationships that Miss Brody has fostered, manipulated, and misunderstood. At the core of this chapter lies the revelation of Mr. Lloyd's genuine but misdirected love for Miss Brody, a love that finds expression not through words or direct action but through art. The irony becomes sharp when Mr. Lloyd tells Sandy that he plans to paint the entire Brody set, and she sarcastically suggests that they will all look like one big Miss Brody. Her tone, filled with a near threatening insolence, reveals not only her awareness of the situation but also her power over him at that moment. Miss Brodie, throughout the novel, has been herself as a puppeteer, controlling the fates of her chosen girls from behind the scenes. She had envisioned Rose as the sensual physical companion for Mr. Lloyd, and Sandy as the intellectual observer, a secret agent who would report back to her. In reality, it is Sandy who becomes intimately involved with Mr. Lloyd, not Rose. This miscalculation on Miss Brodie's part signals the beginning of her downfall. Her once unquestioned control over her pupils' inner lives begins to unravel. The very student she trusted most to carry out her vision is the one who ultimately defies and betrays her. Simultaneously, Miss Brodie's emotional entanglements with Mr. Lowther reach an unceremonious end. After 2 years of companionship, filled with subtle manipulation and emotional ambiguity, Mr. Lowther decides to marry Miss Lockhart, the senior school science teacher. This comes as a great blow to Miss Brodie. In chapter 6, the narrative moves towards the culmination of Jean Brodie's rise and fall. Her once commanding presence in the school and over her set begins to visibly decline, signaling that her prime, both in influence and personal allure, is fading. Despite this, the Brodie set, now maturing into young women with lives of their own, still view Miss Brodie as a fascinating and a charismatic figure, though their admiration has shifted from idealistic reverence to a more nuanced, distanced form of respect. The girls have developed outside interests and begun to define themselves beyond Brodie's influence. Eunice dives into sports and relationships. Monica and Mary do community service. Jenny pursue acting. Rose continues to model for Mr. Lloyd. And Sandy, with growing independence, begins to study psychology. As they move towards adult life, their path begins to diverge, and so does their dependence on Mr. Brodie, Miss Brodie. Sandy has now become Sister Helena, and she reflects on the depth of Brodie's failure. She acknowledges that Miss Brodie's greatest tragedy was not her romantic entanglements or personal eccentricities, but her ideological blindness, her belief that she could mold young lives according to her whims. Sandy is the one who both comprehends and rejects her vision that Miss Brodie had ultimately led towards all of them. The final line of the chapter, and arguably the noble's moral fulcrum, comes when Sandy says it is possible to betray where loyalty is due. Sandy's betrayal then is not a betrayal of cruelty or revenge, it is an act of moral clarity, a necessary step that she should be taking in dismantling a dangerously misguided influence. Miss Brodie's romanticism, charisma, and control are revealed not as virtues but as illusions, and Sandy is the one who dares to shatter them. So, this is End of Unit 2. We quickly go to Unit 3, analyzing the text. The narrative technique, which is a masterful use of structure to achieve brevity and depth. Spark avoids sprawling plots and a wide cast of characters. Instead, she focuses her novel tightly around a small, intimate group, the six girls of the Brody set, and their charismatic, controversial teacher. Spark's style isn't merely economical, it's purposefully pared down, enabling her to explore complex ideas about influence and manipulation. Sparks believed that fiction should convey some kind of truth, and by narrowing her narrative lens, she makes the truth more precise. The reactions of all the girls in the set, their decisions, their future, all serve to expose the contradictions within Brody herself. Her idealism, her authoritarianism, her love for art and men, and her fascination with fascist leaders. Spark further enriches the narrative through her signature technique of narrative layering, particularly through the fictional stories written by Sandy and Jenny. Spark deftly critiques the very idea of idealized role models and romantic destiny. A key element of Spark's narrative construction is her rejection is her rejection of linear time. She employs a non-chronological flash forward technique that is strikingly modern right from the beginning. Spark reveals how each of the girls will turn out in adulthood. By doing so, she removes the suspense of what happens and shifts the reader's focus to why it happens. This allows the novel to operate as a psychological investigation rather than a traditional set of story. There is a manipulation of time that also adds depth and irony to the character's development. For example, Mary McGregor's tragic adult death is framed early in the novel. This knowledge cast a poignant shadow over her portrayal as a schoolgirl, clumsy, slow, constantly rebuked. Spark also uses third person omniscient narration, but in a manner that is intimate rather than detached. The story moves fluidly through the perspectives of Miss Brodie and Sandy, providing access to both their internal worlds. Spark does not over explain motives or resort to moral preaching. Instead, her technique is one of the subtle exposure, showing us the cracks beneath Brodie's surface brilliance and revealing the inner evolution of Sandy from a passive admirer to a quiet subverter. The plot of the novel is tightly around a small interconnected group of characters, all having their specific constructed illusions that begin to unravel when one by one the characters become emotionally connected, involved with Miss Brodie. The deeper unraveling, however, comes from within the Brodie set itself, specifically from Sandy Stranger, a perceptive and intellectually curious girl who ultimately becomes both Miss Brodie's undoing and the novel's moral center. Sandy is the first to detect the fraudulence in Miss Brodie's behavior. She studies Mr. Lloyd's portraits and notices that all of them, regardless of the model, bear a strong resemblance to Miss Brodie, suggesting an obsessive infatuation he cannot express openly. Miss Brody attempts to manipulate Sandy and Rose into fulfilling her fantasy of a romantic entanglement between Rose and Mr. Lloyd, with Sandy acting as the observer. Instead, it is Sandy who begins an affair with Lloyd, flipping the power dynamics and revealing the teacher's inability to control reality. For Sandy, this moment is revelatory. It confirms what she has suspected, that Miss Brody's ideological posturing, masked as educational progressiveness, is irresponsible, reckless, and even fatal. Sandy thus complicates the narrative arc from pupil to judge, from influence to autonomous. Her betrayal is not rooted in personal vengeance, but in an understanding that Miss Brodie is too dangerous to be allowed near impressionable minds. Ultimately, Miss Brodie's downfall underscores one of the central concerns of Muriel Sparks' fiction, the conflict between orthodoxy and non-conformity. In the characterization section, at the center is the dynamic Miss Jean Brodie, a self assured, eccentric teacher who has authority over six girls. She believes that she can mold the destinies of these girls. She has power over girls, and she believes that her relationship with them can form or leverage during the moments of confrontation with the school's administration when they would be able to stand on behalf of her. Rose and Sandy, these are the two main characters where Miss Brodie tries to manipulate, planning the girl's future. She tries to orchestrate a romantic liaison between Rose and Mr. Floyd while expecting Sandy to report back to her. This is not simply interference, it is a clear abuse of her authority, turning her students into pawns in her personal dramas. The character who sees all of these is Sandy Stranger. She's the one who notices that every portrait painted by Mr. Lloyd, regardless of the sitter, bears Miss Brodie's likeness. Sandy's growth is also portrayed as complicated and morally ambiguous. Her affairs with Mr. Lloyd, followed by her entry into a convent and the writing of the theological treatise, show a woman still wrestling with guilt and a desire for control. Ultimately, the characters in the novel are more about power, perception, and betrayal. Miss Brodie's tragic flaw in her arrogance, the belief that she can dictate the lives of others without consequences. So we take a break and we will try to connect in the next 10 minutes. In the next 10 minutes, we meet again. And then we finish with the rest of the two blocks 10 minutes from now. Thank you. Okay, so welcome back. I was trying to join, but I see there are a lot of technical issues this side because of heavy rain. Okay, so we are done with the unit 3, which is analyzing the text, and this is only part 1, and we are left with two more units. This is about the next unit, unit 4, that analyzes the text in the second most elemented format way. So, yes, so this is analysis of the text 2 and unit 4, the elements of autobiography. In this section, you would find Muriel Sparks' personal background and how it influenced the creation of the novel. It is taken from Sparks' autobiography Curriculum Vitae, in which she reflects on her time at James Gillespie's High School for Girls. In Situated in Edinburgh, a school that played a significant role in shaping her worldview and literary imagination. Spark begins by highlighting the rich tradition of education in Edinburgh, particularly how prosperous tradesmen from the 16th century onwards showed civic responsibility and foresight by founding schools. These tradesmen often left behind large fortunes to fund educational institutions, demonstrating the Scottish belief that education should be accessible to all and not restricted by class or wealth. This civic minded generosity allowed schools like Gillespie's to flourish and provide quality education at affordable costs, thus benefiting children from families like Sparks. The school Muriel Spark attended, James Gillespie's High School, was established in 1797 by a wealthy snuff merchant, James Gillespie, who donated a significant portion of this wealth to the cause of education. Spark acknowledges the gratitude, noting that the endowments provided allowed her and others from modest backgrounds to access the level of education far superior to what their tuition fees alone could have afforded. This point is important because it underscores the role of philanthropy in democratizing education, which became a key theme in Sparks' later reflections and fictional works. The second part of the passage transitions to discuss how Sparks' school's experiences informed her fiction, particularly her most famous novel, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, where Sparks spent 12 years at James Gillespie's, and the school deeply influenced her literary imagination. The character of Miss Jean Brodie is based on one of the characters, real life characters in Sparks' life, Miss Christina Kay, whom Spark admired greatly. Kay had a vivid and commanding personality, and although the fictional Miss Brodie shares many of Kay's traits, such as her charisma, passion for art, and unorthodox teaching methods, there is an important difference between the real and fictional characters. While Miss Kay was an exhilarating and impressive teacher, Sparks' fictional representation goes beyond homage. The name Brodie itself was not taken from Miss Kay but borrowed from another source, a young American woman named Charlotte Brodie, who taught Spark to read. And when she was only 3 years old, there was a blend of influences that was clearly seen in Spark's character and was not a simple replica of Miss K, rather a composite figure drawing from other people in Spark's life. Miss K, who had likely lost a fiance in World War I, represented a generation of intelligent, academically gifted women who remained unmarried due to the devastating loss of young men during the war. Spark acknowledges this reality, but instead of presenting Miss K as tragic or emotionally stunted, she celebrates her influence, quoting John Steinbeck's words that teaching might be the greatest of the arts because it walks directly on the human mind and spirit. The characters of Mr. Lloyd and Mr. Lothar also find inspiration from real life figures at Spark School. Mr. Wishart, her singing teacher, and Mr. Gordon, the history teacher, were combined to create Mr. Lothar. Mr. Gordon's habit of playing with Spark's hair is paralleled in the novel by Mr. Lothar's gentle fatherly interactions with the girls. Similarly, Spark's real art teacher, Mr. Cowling, inspired Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Cowling's eccentric teaching technique, lying on the floor to silence the class, was transformed into Mr. Lloyd's artistic commanding presence in the novel. Spark's early experiences of friendship and imagination are also woven in the fictional world. Her close bond with Francis Nevin becomes the basic of Sandy and Jenny's friendship in the novel. Their shared holiday at Crail and the act of co writing a romantic story that they eventually destroyed is recreated in the novel, where Sandy and Jenny similarly construct a fictional account of Miss Brody's love life, reflecting both their budding creativity and curiosity about adult relationships. Ultimately, these detailed comparisons show how the book is rooted in personal experiences yet elevated through fiction. Mural Spark took elements from her real life teachers and classmates and transformed them through literary imagination into novels that explore the power, danger, and artistry of education. While Miss K inspired the brilliance of Miss Brodie's character, Spark's fiction allows her to explore not only admiration but also the risks of manipulative influence, ideological extremism, and emotional projection, creating a richly layered and endured literary work. Murray's Spark uses the prime of Miss Jean Brodie to portray 1930s Edinburgh, showing a city divided between the protected middle class world of her characters and the harsh reality of urban poverty and social decay. Among the Brodie set, it is Sandy who is most affected. Her reaction reveals a deeper emotional and moral sensitivity. Unlike others, she sees beyond her privileged perspective and is deeply disturbed by the suffering she witnesses. This moment becomes a turning point in Sandy's growth. In her later life as a nun, she reflects on the horror of that day and understands it more fully, no longer reacting with fear or emotional retreat as she did when young, but instead with compassion and empathy. There is a subsection, Perspective on Faith, where the novel reflects the shift in fiction following the First World War, where political themes began to fade and were replaced by a stronger focus on religious and moral issues. In the novel, Spark uses the characters of Miss Brodie and Sandy to represent two contrasting strands of Christianity. Miss Brodie's worldview aligns with Calvinism, a doctrine that emphasizes predestination and individual discipline, while Sandy, her student, grows increasingly drawn to Roman Catholicism, which is steeped in tradition, ritual, and the authority of the church. To understand the divergence between Catholicism and the beliefs followed by Miss Brodie, One must look at the Protestant Reformation, which took place in 16th century. It was a major movement that marked the split from the Romantic Catholic Church, initiated by figures such as Martin Luther, a former monk who challenged church practices, particularly the sale of indulgences. This reform began in Germany and was instrumental in shaping alternative Christian ideologies like Calvinism and Presbyterianism, the latter of which was championed by figures such as John Knox and deeply influenced religious thought in Scotland, where the novel is set. There is an issue of morality where the author explores deep moral and psychological complexity by focusing on the character of Miss Brodie and her influence on her students, especially Sandy. Miss Brodie is portrayed as a morally confused figure who uses her religious convictions to justify her actions. Her belief that God was on her side gives her a false sense of moral authority and spiritual justification, which she uses to manipulate and control her stories. This false metaphysical confidence leads her to overstep moral boundaries and convinces her that the choice, even questionable one, are in her of traditional right and wrong. The contrast between Miss Brodie's narrow moral outlook and the eventual emotional and spiritual growth of her students, especially Sandy and Jenny, becomes a central theme. Once freed from Miss Brodie's influences, these girls begin to perceive a world full of limitless possibilities. For example, Jenny's experience in Rome opens her eyes to romantic and emotional depth, while Sandy's conversion to Catholicism brings her a deep sense of mystery and spiritual fullness. Sandy describes her mind as being filled with things visible and invisible. Despite holding opposing moral views, Miss Brodie and Sandy share a deep connection. Both are engaged in the transformation of everyday life. There is an issue of fascism. The novel examines the issue of fascism not just in its political sense, but also in the moral and psychological control one person can exert over others. Mural's Path highlights the eternal struggle between good and evil by portraying evil as the attempt to dominate human beings. This concept is embodied in the character of Miss Brodie, who seeks to shape and manipulate her students to fit her vision of greatness. There is a contradiction in Miss Brodie's philosophy of education and how it ultimately contributes to her downfall. Miss Brodie's downfall is portrayed as both personal and ideological. Her betrayal by one of her own girls and the failure of her methods serve as a metaphor for the defeat of fascism itself. This is Unit 4, and the last unit of Block 9 is the novel 1960s and after. The novel 1960s and after. This is the unit 5. The novel in 1960s marked a major turning point in literature due to the rapidly changing social, political, economic, and cultural landscape. The Cold War tensions between US and the Soviet Union, the race, the Vietnam War, the nuclear threat, the rise of black power, and the women's movement all contributed to a shift in how people perceived reality and history. This era is often called as the swinging 60s, symbolizing a spirit of new consciousness defined by cultural rebellion, generational defiance, and a wave of affluence. As a result, new cultural movements emerged: rock music, psychedelic art, radical theatre, and alternative presses all gained prominence, reflecting liberal sexual and political behaviors. These changes fed into a counterculture that eventually led to the postmodern movement in literature. The literary response to this shift involved a philosophical transformation, especially under the influence of structuralism and deconstruction. Literature was no longer about resolving the gap between language and lived experience. Instead, it became self respective, focusing on the nature of language and writing itself. Writers struggled to place themselves within the text as language became a barrier rather than a bridge to reality. This led to a rejection of traditional narrative structures such as linear plotlines, fixed character development, and chronological storytelling. In the British context, this evolution manifested through a newfound engagement with metafiction, a form that emphasized the mixing of different literary styles, traditions, and forms. The evolution of British fiction in the 1960s within the broader framework of global postmodernism was highly influenced by new linguistic theories and philosophical shifts. Simultaneously, there were authors like Eva Figes, Alan Burns, David Cort, Michael Mooncock continued this trend of experimentation, with many using chaos and fantasy to reflect the social disarray of the times. Throughout 1960s, British novel was marked by a rich tension between continuity and change. While some writers broke traditional forms, others revised them from within. What united them was a self-awareness of the novel as a form, a willingness to interrogate truth, identity, and artistic representation, and a growing preoccupation with fantasy, language, and the shifting structures of reality. Next in the same section is novel in the 1970s. 1970s were a transitional and somewhat muted period for British fiction. Compared to the dynamism of the 1960s and the renewed energy of the 1980s, this decade is often seen as lacking vitality, stylistically and thematically. While the swinging 60s had brought a surge of experimentation and creative excitement, the 1970s appeared to sag under the weight of a literary identity in flux. One of the most significant developments in this period was the founding of the Booker Prize in 1969. It not only introduced a competitive edge to literature, but also helped turn fiction into a market driven cultural product. At the same time, fiction returned to fictions of identity, particularly concerning empire and colonial history. J.G. Farrell's The Sage to Krishnapur and the Singapore Grip revisited colonial episodes to critically examine the ideologies and sustained empire. The 1970s also saw the emergence of new historical and political contexts within British fiction. John Le Carre addressed Cold War tensions and institutional decay in novels like Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, and The Honorable Schoolboy, which functioned not only as spy thrillers but also as meditations on British decline and disillusionment. Feminist fiction gained significant momentum, with writers like Angela Carter and Maureen Duffy exploring female identity, sexuality, and fantasy through the lens of magic realism. Towards the later half of the decade, young writers like Martin Amis and Ian McEwan brought a new interest in the grotesque, the shocking, and the psychologically complex books. By the end of 1970s, the critical assessment of British fiction was not entirely favorable. Leading literary magazines like the New Review and Granta lamented the state of the contemporary novel, calling it parochial and lacking in reader engagement. British fiction moved towards greater diversity in themes, settings, and narratives, laying the groundwork of the revitalized literary scene of the 1980s and beyond. Next, the novel from 1980s. This period reflects a rapid transformation and deep discontent shaped by global economic changes, the oil crisis, rising international tensions, and the political shift brought about by Margaret Thatcher's rise to power in 1979. Her tenure marked a fundamental change in British society as free market ideology took hold, bringing with it a new emphasis on consumerism, competition, and commodification. The period from Thatcher's election to her departure in 1990 was marked by significant political and social upheaval. Many writers during this time channeled a sense of urban despair and Gothic decay, invoking the spirit of Charles Dickens to portray contemporary Britain. The decline and end of various empires, colonial, industrial, and even familial, form another major theme of the 1980s novel. The 1980s also witnessed daring formal and stylistic experiments. Tom Phillips' Humiment is a striking example, a graphic novel created by painting over the pages of a forgotten Victorian novel. While style and technique were evolving, the geographical range of British fiction expanded significantly. Africa appeared in the works of William Boyd, South Africa in those of Christopher Hope, and the Middle East and the continental Europe in the fiction of Anita Bruckner and Julian Barnes. Multiculturalism came to be defined. Writers of diverse origins began to transform the literary landscape with stories that reflected hybrid identities, post colonial realities, and global consciousness. Thus, the novel since the 1980s can be seen as dynamic, multifaceted response to political upheaval, cultural fragmentation, and global transformation. It blends realism with postmodern experimentation, critiques capitalism and imperial legacies, and foregrounds voices previously marginalized in the British literary canon. In this period, the novel became the powerful space for negotiating identity, history, and the human condition in a world that was becoming ever more interconnected and unstable. So, this is the end of Unit 5 and end of Block 9. So, thank you, all of you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am, for the lecture.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, ma'am.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, mom.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for doing this. This was really helpful.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you.
Hello.
Padma has a question.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, can
Yes.
we have your counseling further on LMS portal or
Uh, Come again, please. I could not get your words.
can we have counseling from you further?
Padma, actually, so sorry. Here we have a technical glitch because of the climate here. I'm not getting. Would you mind writing it in the message? Probably
Okay,
I'll get your words.
okay, okay. Okay.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. 4122 AN. You raise hands. Yes, please. Thank you. I don't find the name here. Somebody is 4I underscore 22 underscore AN.
Hello. Hello,
Yes,
ma'am.
yes. Yes, ma'am,
Yes, ma'am.
please.
Yeah, yeah. That day we asked about the word limit for the assignment. I couldn't attend the class after that. Did
Okay.
you get to know about that?
No, there is no word limit as such, but they were asking me to ask all of you to revisit the LMS portal and revisit the instructions which is given. So basically, they did not come with a word limit.
Because I don't have any access to LMS portal. I am doing ODL distance mode. I'm not doing online. So
You're
I read all the instructions. It is not mentioned in that.
okay. Just give me 1 second. Maybe I'll try a call right
Yeah.
away, and maybe I'll come up.
Okay.
Would you
Yeah.
write down your question so that in
Sure,
the
sure.
call?
And
Huh?
yeah, yeah. I have two questions. I'll write down. Yeah.
So what I'm trying to tell all of you is your voices are not reaching me. So why don't you write it down? I'll try calling them here itself when all of you are present, and maybe I can guide you with that. Amit, to answer your question, Amit, am I audible to you, Amit?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. I'm able to hear you.
Yes, yes. So to answer your question, I would always suggest all the students to go ahead for suggested readings. Um, but yes, you have the PDF materials and also the live lectures. If you have attended, if you have ensured you have written down some notes, and you also find the audio recordings available. So nothing like it. But suggested readings will only help you make your vision of writing better. So that is it.
Yeah, just
Meanwhile, I'll get
thank
back
you.
to that question, how to access recordings and the word limit you asked, right? A word limit for assignment. Just give me a second. I will be on the call with them. Well, I'm calling the director here. I think he's busy. He'll definitely give a call back. Meanwhile, to answer the question, Bhavna Bharadwaj, if you're listening,
Yes, ma'am.
yeah, it is ResearchGate. I'll just type it down here for all of you. ResearchGate is one of the platform where you get a number of published already published work. Okay, so that can also help you uh, get more information about topics.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
ठीक ଅଛି ତାହେଲେ ମୁଁ ସେ ଜଣେଇ ଦଉଛି ଓକେ ଥ୍ୟାଙ୍କ ୟୁ ଆଜ୍ଞା ଆଜ୍ଞା so students so for the assignment the word limit will be given to you okay and regarding the video the audio recordings it will take time to upload for them so maybe you'll keep a track maybe in 15 or 1 month they will be able to 15 days or 1 month they will be able to upload the sessions on the LMS portal. I hope I was able to clarify your questions regarding the assignment word limit that will be given to all of you in the instruction itself. Padma, I got no idea about the time schedule for tomorrow's session. I mean,